The ink brush moved with a whisper-soft rhythm in her hand, a sound almost lost beneath the drone of late summer insects against the window pane. From his chair on the porch, Silas Blackwood could see the silhouette of his wife, Lynn, framed by the lamplight. She had been his wife for 3 weeks, a stranger delivered by the Tuesday stagecoach along with a crate of tinned goods and the territorial newspaper. Her back was straight, her head bowed over the delicate rice paper. She wore the same plain red dress she had arrived in, a slash of impossible color against the dusty brown of his Nevada homestead. Every night since she arrived, she performed this ritual. After the dishes were washed and the cabin fell into the heavy quiet of the high desert, she would unseal her small wooden box of supplies, grind the ink stick, and begin to write. Silas had built the cabin himself, felling the timber and setting the stones for the hearth. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every warp in the wood. But the world she created with those intricate characters was a territory more foreign to him than any unmapped canyon. He was supposed to believe that. He had paid the matchmaker a hefty sum for a wife who would be quiet, hard-working, and respectable. The advertisement had said nothing of beauty, but she was that, too, in a way that made his chest feel tight. It had also, by omission, assumed his ignorance. Silas ran a hand over his jaw, the scrape of his beard a rough counterpoint to the memory of her brush whisper. He was a man known for what he could do with his hands, and none of it was gentle. He could break a horse, raise a barn, and end a man's argument from 50 yards. The calluses on his palms were a map of a hard life. No one in the town of Redemption, or anywhere else he'd been for 20 years, would ever suspect that Silas Blackwood could read English, let alone the complex, flowing characters she painted onto the page. But his father had not been a rancher or a gunman. He had been a missionary, a man obsessed with language, who had dragged his son across the world before a fever took him in a port city Silas could no longer name. Silas had inherited his father's books, and a mind that held onto languages like a miser holds onto gold. He had kept his secret buried deep, a useless skill in a world that paid for fast hands and a steady eye. It was safer to be underestimated. But now, this woman, his wife, was writing letters home. She thought she was writing into a void, sending her private thoughts thousands of miles away to a family he would never meet. She had no idea that her confidant was sitting just 30 feet away, watching the sunset bleed across the mountains. After she was asleep, he would retrieve the discarded practice sheets from the kindling box. He would smooth them out on the table, and in the last of the embers' glow, he would read everything. The first letters were simple things, descriptions of the land. She wrote of the dust, a fine red powder that coated everything. She described the way the mountains turned purple at dusk, and the silence, which she called a heavy, listening quiet. She wrote of him, too. "My husband is a large man," she had written on the 3rd night. "His hands are hard from work, but he has never spoken a harsh word to me. He is quiet. His eyes watch everything, but I do not know what he is thinking." Silas had folded that piece of paper and tucked it into his pocket, the words a strange and unsettling comfort. He was a provider, a protector. That was the bargain they had made. But as he sat there on the porch, the gnawing truth was that he was also a spy in his own home. He was deceiving her in the most intimate way possible, by stealing the thoughts she believed were hers alone. He told himself it was for her protection, to know if she was unhappy, to understand what she needed. It was a lie, and he knew it. It was a hunger to know the woman who shared his roof, a hunger he had no honorable way to satisfy. The confrontation came not from within the cabin's walls, but from the open range. Jedediah Thorne owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, and he believed that ownership extended to the water that flowed through it. The creek that bordered Silas's homestead was modest, but it was the lifeblood of his small herd, and the garden Lynn had begun to tend with meticulous care. One blistering afternoon, Thorne arrived with 3 of his ranch hands, their horses kicking up a cloud of that same red dust Lynn had written about. Thorne was a man who smiled when he was angry. He was smiling now, a wide, predatory expression under the brim of his hat. "Blackwood," he said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Having a bit of a dry spell. I'm thinking this little trickle of yours would be better served up at my main grazing pasture." Silas didn't move from the porch step he was mending. He kept his hands in view, one resting on the hammer, the other on his knee. "This creek is on my deed, Thorn. The survey markers are clear." "Markers can get moved," Thorn chuckled, and his men chuckled with him. "Fences can break. Homesteads can have accidents." The threat hung in the shimmering heat. It was the old language of the West, the one Silas knew best. A simple, brutal grammar of force. He could feel the familiar coldness settling in his gut, the instinct to reach for the Colt holstered on the peg just inside the door. But then the cabin door opened. Lynn stepped out, holding a small clay pot with a wilting tomato plant in it. She looked at the parched earth, then at the men on their horses, her expression unreadable. She did not look at Silas. Thorn's eyes slid over to her, his smile turning into a leer. "Well now. Got yourself some exotic decoration, Blackwood?" One of the hands snickered. "Don't see many of them out this way." Silas's hand tightened on the hammer. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears. This was the moment it would all turn ugly. But before he could rise, Lynn spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a bell. "The Homestead Act of 1862, Section 4, she said, her English precise, accented but perfectly clear. "It specifies riparian rights are attached to the land parcel at the time of claim. The territorial survey map, filed in Carson City in 1871, shows this watercourse as the property boundary." The silence that followed was absolute. Thorn's smile vanished. His men shifted in their saddles, looking from the small woman in the red dress to their boss, their expressions slack with confusion. They had come expecting a fight with a dumb gunslinger. They had not expected a legal lecture from his foreign wife. Lynn took a step forward, holding up the dying plant. "This water belongs to this land." "You are stealing." She didn't say it like an accusation. She said it like a fact, as undeniable as the sun overhead. Thorn stared at her, his face flushing a dull red. He seemed at a loss, the script he had prepared suddenly useless. He had come to intimidate, to threaten violence, but he was being met with something he didn't understand. He couldn't bully a law book. He couldn't shoot a paragraph. He finally turned his glare back to Silas. "You keep your woman on a short leash, Blackwood." "She seems to know her rights," Silas said, his voice level. He allowed himself a small, cold smile. "And so do I." Thorn spat into the dust. "This ain't over." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. The dust settled. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was charged with the ghost of the confrontation. Silas looked at Lynn. She was still holding the pot, her knuckles white. He had thought he was her protector, the shield between her and this harsh country. But she had just faced down Jedediah Thorn with a law she shouldn't have known and a courage he hadn't expected. She had protected the homestead. She had protected him. That night, he waited with an almost unbearable tension for her to begin writing. When she finally did, her brush strokes seemed faster, sharper. He gave her an extra hour after the light went out before he moved from his cot to the table. He carefully retrieved the practice sheets. His hands, which had been so steady facing Thorn, trembled as he smoothed the paper. He had expected to read of fear, of her terror at the armed men, of a desire to flee this violent place. Instead, he found a cold, brilliant analysis. "He is a man of brute force," she wrote, "but not of intellect. He thinks the law is a suggestion." The territorial clerk in Carson City, a Mr. Abernathy, filed the survey. A telegraph to him could confirm the original document. The deed states the boundary is the center line of the perennial stream. His diversion of the water does not change the boundary. He is trespassing. She went on, page after page, dissecting Thorn's legal and practical weaknesses. She outlined a strategy, mentioning the cost of sending a wire, the authority of a U.S. Marshal, the legal precedent for water disputes she must have read about somewhere. She was not afraid. She was furious. And she was fighting back with the only weapon she had, her mind and her ink brush. Silas stared at the elegant, sharp characters under the moonlight filtering through the window. He had married a woman he thought he needed to protect. He now understood he had allied himself with a general. He had expected to read a plea for rescue, instead, he was reading a plan for war. The next morning, he found her by the creek, staring at the diminished trickle of water. He walked up behind her, the dry ground crunching under his boots. He stopped a few feet away, unsure how to begin. The silence stretched between them, filled with the things they did not say. A telegraph to the territorial clerk in Carson City would be expensive, he said, his voice raspy. Lynn went perfectly still. She did not turn. For a long moment, she said nothing. The air grew thick with tension. Silas could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. He had crossed a line. He had revealed a piece of what he knew. Finally, she turned to face him. Her dark eyes searched his face, her expression a mask of cautious curiosity. "How would you know to suggest that?" she asked, her voice low. This was the moment. He could lie, make up some story about hearing it in town. Or he could tell her a piece of the truth. "My father," he began, the words feeling strange and rusty in his mouth. He wasn't from around here. He believed knowing the law was as important as knowing how to load a gun. It was not the whole truth, but it was a start. It was an offering. A flicker of understanding passed through her eyes. She was reassessing him, recalibrating everything she thought she knew. "Your father was a wise man," she said softly. "He had his moments," Silas admitted. "Let's go over the deed. Together." That afternoon, for the first time, they sat at the table not as a man and his wife in their separate worlds, but as partners. He spread the land deed out, its creases worn and soft. Lynn traced the legal language with a slender finger, her English improving with every clause she read aloud. She pointed to the same phrase she had identified in her letter, sent a line of the perennial stream. Her mind was as sharp as a newly honed blade. Together, they drafted a telegraph to Mr. Abernathy in the capital. It was Silas who rode to town to send it, the $20 for the transmission a worthy investment in the war, Lynn had declared. Thorne did not wait for the law to answer. 2 nights later, they were woken by the sound of splintering wood and the terrified whinnying of Silas's horse. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant. In the pale moonlight, he saw 2 of Thorne's men tearing down a section of his corral fence, driving his small herd out into the open range. It was a petty, vicious act of intimidation. He fired a warning shot into the air, and the men scrambled onto their horses and fled into the darkness. It took him until dawn to round up his scattered cattle. He returned to the cabin exhausted, angry, and cold with the knowledge that this would not stop. Thorne would bleed him dry, one broken fence, one strayed cow at a time. He could sell the homestead for next to nothing and move on. It was what he had always done when trouble found him. But when he walked into the cabin, he saw Lynn sitting at the table, a steaming cup of coffee waiting for him. She had not been sleeping. She had been waiting. Her face was pale, but her eyes were resolute. In that moment, Silas knew he was not leaving. Running would mean leaving her, and that had become unthinkable. This piece of land, this small cabin, was no longer just his. It was theirs. And he would not be driven off. He sat down across from her, the rifle leaning against the wall. The smell of the coffee filled the small room. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and knew he could no longer carry his secret. It was a wall between them, and he needed her on his side of it, all the way. "Lynn," he said, his voice quiet. "I have not been honest with you." She watched him, her hands wrapped around her own cup, waiting. "When I was a boy," he said, forcing himself to meet her gaze, "my father took me to live in China for 5 years. He was a man of books. He made sure I learned." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. "I can read. I can read your letters." Her eyes widened, a flicker of shock, of violation. It was the reaction he had dreaded. He saw the wall go up between them, higher and stronger than any secret. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the folded, worn piece of rice paper from her first week, the one he had carried ever since. He smoothed it on the table between them. He pointed to a line of characters. His hands are hard from work, he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. But he has never spoken a harsh word to me. He looked up at her, laying his deception bare. I read them because I had to know you. And I was too much of a coward to ask. She stared at the paper, then back at his face. He watched a storm of emotions cross hers, anger, betrayal, and then, something else he couldn't name. It was a deep, soul-shaking vulnerability. He had seen her private thoughts, the ones she believed were safe. He had broken her trust completely. He expected her to stand, to scream, to pack her few belongings. Instead, she reached out and her finger traced the characters he had just read. Your pronunciation is terrible, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. You sound like a drunken mule trader from Guangzhou. And then, she smiled. It was the first real smile he had ever seen from her, and it was like the sun rising over the mountains. It was forgiveness. It was an invitation. 6 months later, the snow lay thick and heavy on the plains, but the creek by the cabin flowed freely, its banks shored up with new stone. The U.S. Marshal from Carson City had paid a visit to Jedediah Thorne, armed with a certified copy of the original survey and a stern warning about interfering with federal homestead claims. Thorne now tipped his hat when he rode past their property line. Inside the warm cabin, a fire crackled in the hearth. The scent of pine and roasting rabbit filled the air. Silas sat at the table, an ink brush held awkwardly in his large, calloused hand. Across from him, Lynn guided his fingers, her touch light and patient. He was trying to form the character for whom his first attempts were clumsy, thick smudges of black. No, she corrected gently, her voice laced with amusement. Like this. A roof, and then the warmth beneath it. You draw it like you are building it. He tried again, and this time the character had a form, a meaning he could feel. He looked up at her, at the woman who had become his partner in every sense of the word. The bright red dress was packed away in her trunk. She now wore a practical dress of blue wool she had ordered from the catalogue, a garment for a woman who was here to stay. They spoke more now, in a mix of his rough English and her patient corrections of his Chinese. They had built a language of their own, somewhere in between. He had sought a wife for his homestead, a quiet presence to fill the silence. He had found a warrior who fought with words, a teacher who showed him the shape of his own home. He looked at the character he had drawn, the simple lines that held so much. He had learned that a man is not defined by the reputation that follows him, but by the choices he makes when he has something to defend. And a home was not just a plot of land or a cabin built of timber, but a space of shared understanding, a place where even the deepest secrets could be brought into the light and forgiven. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.